This is the End of the Road podcast with your host, Michael Coco. Exploring the horizons we never touch because we're already there.
Welcome, and thanks for listening. Tonight we're off to Pittsburg with Lenny, also known as Joseph L. Flatley. We're talking about his new book on Timothy Leary. Yes, that Timothy Leary. The Timothy Leary that you thought you knew, but no. As Lenny wonderfully points out, there was an occult side of Timothy Leary, and that's the title of his new book called The Occult Timothy Leary, subtitled The Tarot, Magical States and Post-Terrestrial Evolution. And as you're going to hear, Mr. Leary had all kinds of wonderful flashes of brilliance. And of course, maybe his follow-through was a little bit lacking, somewhat problematic, probably not aided by the fact that he was often on the run from the law or authoritarian structures. Yes, Mr. Leary, I think, left us with many unanswered questions, but a sense that he was really pointing to something really interesting. And that's what I think Lenny's book really captures. A brilliance that wasn't really linear in the way that we're thinking it was, but more like a tarot deck. A conglomeration of a little bit of this and a little bit of that, depending on what sort of cards you draw. All the while pointing to something transcendent and whole. And of course, mischievous. Enjoy. Lenny, I love this new book, and I saw that the dedication of it, I think, has some weight to it. You dedicated the book to Robert Anton Wilson, who once told me he doesn't fear death. And I'm probably going to mispronounce the Finnish esotericist that you also dedicated it to.
Oh, Antero Olli.
Yeah.
I'm glad you noticed that. No one has asked me about that before. But yeah, I only interacted with Robert Anton Wilson once or twice. And I was taking a class that he was teaching online, and he kind of disappeared for a few days. And he came back and he was like, yeah, I collapsed. Like, this is towards the end of his life. So he's like, I collapsed in the bathroom and I was stuck there for like a day or two. I can't remember exactly, until his daughter found him. And he was like, the interesting thing is, I realized that I didn't fear death. While I was sitting there wondering if I was going to die. And I thought, wow, that's kind of profound. And it always stuck with me. And then when Antero was passing, I always get years wrong. So this would have been like 2003, I believe. He was diagnosed, I believe, with lymphoma, and he decided not to fight it. He wanted to have a good quality of life as long as possible, and didn't want to, deal with the medicalized, extension of his doomed life, I guess. And so I mentioned that to him, and what Bob said to me, and he was like, yeah, I have to agree. So that always stuck with me.
Yeah, and it's interesting that both of them were definitely interested or interacted with Timothy Leary, the subject of your book, as well.
Yeah, and made contributions. So the subject of the book is largely the 8 circuits of consciousness, which is Timothy Leary's his framework for understanding the various states of consciousness accessed through, anything from mystical or magical practices to yoga to, psychology. I think certain types of psychotherapy, like active imagination practices and stuff. It's they all kind of overlap. I wouldn't necessarily say that all experiences are the same, but they're all forms of consciousness, and we all, so that's kind of the what unifies all these different domains. And I thought, and I just have been fascinated by this perspective But Tim was, I feel like he, he started out as a Harvard psychologist. Well, he started out as a psychologist. He ended up a lecturer at Harvard. I don't believe he was ever super comfortable with the scientific method or what you're supposed to do when you're practicing science. So I think he got out of that scene. When psychedelics came along and he realized that there's another rich field that he could explore, he kind of, he split. He started exploring consciousness in his own way, but he was never like the best chronicler of his own thoughts, and he didn't always take them to their furthest, to their furthest ramifications, or even maybe stress test them. So Wilson and Ali, you really have to give credit for making his Leary's ideas, for exploring them and making them comprehensible in a lot of ways. Leary liked to write. His favorite writer was James Joyce, so he liked to experiment with language, and he liked to see what people can get out of nonlinear language and nonlinear thinking. But you also have to, at times, like, use consistent names for things and spell things correct. Like, do like kind of the very basic, boring work of like making your ideas intelligible, which seems to have bored Leary. But Wilson and Ali definitely, one of the reasons we're still talking about Timothy Leary is because of those two. And I see my book as a further kind of like Timothy Leary for dummies. It's like, I don't like pretend that I made any like great contributions to the field of consciousness studies, but I think having, a breezy book you can sit down with in a few hours and get, the Cliff Notes version of what Leary was on about and why it might be important, I think is probably valuable in its own right.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that Leary's favorite author was James Joyce, and you have a little vignette in the book about Ulysses and how that became comprehensible to Mr. Leary after a certain experience.
Yeah, you wonder about that. Like, certainly it felt comprehensible at the time, perhaps, but
yeah,
I mean, I don't. Yeah, it's funny. Wilson, Robert Anton Wilson, also a huge fan of James Joyce and explored his work his entire life. And this class I took with Robert Anton Wilson, I think one of the first, if not the first practices was to analyze like the first paragraph of Finnegan's Wake. We're going back 30 years. So I'm trying to remember what we did, but it was like analyze the first chapter of Finnegan's Wake. And, it's Joyce. He piles references upon references. And that it was so dense that like the references kept going, like even when we got beyond like, when the thing was written, there were like, seemingly there were references to like events and places that took place in what would have been the future when Joyce was writing it. And I'm not entirely sure what that lesson was about. I guess pattern recognition. But it was really wild.
And I don't know if you want to talk about this. I almost had the impression that there was sort of some seminal moments in the 8-circuit model, even early on in Leary's career. And I guess one thing that was really interesting to me in reading the book is I didn't realize that Leary did have some sort of, I know you didn't call him a scientist and he's more of a mystic, but he did have some contributions even to psychiatry.
Absolutely.
And I thought those in some way, I saw that those in some ways blossomed into the 8-circuit model with a little help from LSD. But,
absolutely.
But I wonder if that might be an interesting place to start, at least about, where Leary started with psychology. And then if there was sort of a growth to the 8-circuit model, how it sort of blossomed maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'll leave it to you, but I just.
No, I think that is probably the point, the part of this book that interests me the most is, so Leary, and I I probably say this too, like flippantly, and maybe like I give people the wrong impression. It's not like he wasn't a scientist or couldn't be a scientist or didn't do important work, prior to becoming the LSD guru or whatever. But I don't think that's necessarily where he was the most comfortable. Like he was the head of the Kaiser Foundation in I want to say Berkeley, California, and he was doing a lot of research on personality, and he was the role that I think he was most comfortable playing there, and then later in his psychedelic compound in Millbrook and so on, was he was like the team leader, he was like the coach, so he had a lot of good people working with him in California in the 1950s, and I believe it was largely his flashes of brilliance that him and his team kind of codified into a book called The Interpersonal Diagnosis of Personality. So that's a big book, and it it he comes from the generation coming right out of World War II, where psychology got a huge boost from World War II as a field, as a scientific profession, because up until that point, um, psychology was more seen as like a field of philosophy, wise men and a few women sitting around thinking profound thoughts about why humans are the way they are. There wasn't this like techno scientific element to it. But then you have World War II, and it's like, we need to take, thousands and thousands and thousands of young men and figure out which one could possibly be officers, which ones could be cannon fodder, which ones would be good at this, which ones would be good at that. And that gave that gave the field of psychology a huge boost and kind of scientized it, or quantized it. I'm struggling with the words there, but it's like, it created a scientific profession out of it. And Leary came out of that. So now he's in a situation post World War II. He's actually a World War II era veteran. He was in a training accident and lost hearing in one ear, so he wasn't shipped overseas, but he stayed in Pennsylvania here near me. He was at an army base, and after World War II, basically he had the option to like go to officer candidate school or to like continue his career and get his psychology degree. So he got his he went to school, became a PhD, ended up at the Kaiser Foundation, writing, trying to understand personality and his human personality, and his kind of light bulb was that human personality it's interpersonal. So if I'm sitting in a room staring at a wall, that's not really a good indication of my personality. But once you and I start talking and we start interacting, and something you say or do brings out something in me, that kind of defines, now we're talking about a personality. So he figured out ways to Leary figured out ways to basically plot human personality on a graph or on a piece of paper, and from there, and you see like a remarkable consistency from that early work to his later work in the 60s, once he discovered psilocybin and started thinking more about novel states of consciousness, the ones that we don't necessarily have access to every day, to delivering papers in international conferences with names like the Seven Tongues of God. It was the 60s, but what he meant by that was 7 levels of consciousness. Not quite the same as the 8 circuits of consciousness, but that was a further refinement. But my point is that from his all the way from the kind of beginnings of his professional career, well through his becoming, leaving Harvard, becoming a fugitive, and then, coming back to prison in America, writing these kind of books on post-terrestrial consciousness and the need for us to migrate into outer space as a human species. Um, it's like it's consistent. He's always building on this core idea that he had of discrete levels of consciousness. So when I started this book, I pitched the book because I kind of had a notion that it might be something I want to write about. And how often do you come up with like a unique take on a historical figure that several people have already written books about? So when I decided to kind of look at his 8 circuits of consciousness through the lens of occultism, I could have found that there was nothing to it. I could have I tried to write pretty much everything he had ever written, or at least had published, and it could have been a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, but no, there's remarkable consistency, and it was really impressive to see, kind of watch a great mind unfold over the course of decades.
Yeah, yeah. So it is one of the common themes, like you pointed out, the importance of external influences in consciousness. I mean, it started out earlier, like early in his career, in like group therapy and interpersonal, but then later on, it almost becomes this isn't his word, but cosmic or something that's it's what is the external influence becomes much more expansive than maybe just interpersonal.
Yeah, so I was always fascinated by his take on what he calls terrestrial consciousness, basically like states of consciousness that we all experience every day that are just run-of-the-mill human beings on planet Earth. But the other stuff made no sense to me. Like he's talking about going into your genetics and communicating with the DNA and blah, blah, blah. And it's just very confusing when you don't have a framework for that. And then one day I was sitting here and kind of realized that consciousness, he defines, I should pull that quote up. He defines consciousness as basically a process of the process that happens within the human to when it interacts with outside stimulus. So like he believed that there are many levels of consciousness or forms of consciousness as there are, he uses the word circuits, but before that, there's the biology for processing information. So like at the earliest levels, if we're talking about what he called the oral, actually Robert Anton Wilson called the oral biosurvival circuit, which is like concerned with fleeing danger or going towards nourishment. That's one example of the outside influence is very clear. Or political, or what he calls mammalian consciousness would be like more about pack hierarchy and establishing who's at the top, who's at the bottom, who you're going to listen to, who you're going to fight. The outside stimulus for that's pretty obvious as well. But he believed that it was a whole new ball game once humanity left the Earth and goes to outer space, and we're firing on a whole new level of circuits or consciousness. We need to like purposefully detach from these outside influences. So the very first step of like abandoning or just setting aside the lower circuits is detaching from like outside stimulus and returning to the body and the brain. Because the way he and his colleagues discussed like the human being is in a very like in a Gurdjieffian sense of like a robot. We're not acting, we're reacting. So on the lower levels of consciousness, that's what it's all about. But the goal would be, if you're trying to expand consciousness or try to be more than just a robot, is to access these higher circuits, which allow you to suspend or step away from the outside influences and be self-directed as opposed to just always reacting.
Right. So you want to talk about the neurologic or the eight circuit model and sort of what the components are?
Yeah.
Because I mean you have them listed in the book, but I mean it starts off with biosurvival circuit,
Mm-hmm.
and then ends up with the eighth one, the neuroatomic circuit.
Yeah, I am not good at this. So,
Oh,
but
I don't think he was either.
well, and it's like I wasn't kidding when you said you read his books and he would like describe the same thing three different ways or give it three different names. Like he wasn't interested in except exopsychology, and his book previous to that, Neurologic, were very clear. It was almost like he had gone through his 60s, wow man, you know, spiritual holy man, crazy man phase, and he wanted to build he wanted to write some very basic, basically like a user's manual for the human consciousness. So like those books are very valuable because they're easy to understand. But I'm going to pull up my cheat sheet in Google Docs and we will go through the stages of consciousness because none of this is going to make sense if
sure.
if we don't.
We could start at the top if you want, because I have it that your friend Antonio Ali wrote about the eight circuit brain, the eighth, the neuroatomic circuit. Israel Regardie compared this to the Buddhist concept of Indira's net, where each element is a jewel reflecting every other element in an infinite interdependent network.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful.
An interesting thing, just an aside real quick, is one of the impeti. One of the reasons I wrote this book was because Leary wrote a book called The Game of Life, which is basically he not only believed in these eight circuits as being like states of consciousness, but also he believed that as human beings evolved out of simpler or earlier life on the planet, that these levels of consciousness were kind of like added. So it's like, the the protozoa and the early one cell organisms could be said to have operated on the first level. And then you get like into mammals and now you have like second circuit. But so it's kind of confusing, or, it's kind of complicated because you're talking about individual psychology, but you're also talking about like evolution, the development of species, the development of life on this planet. And so he not only said there were 8 circuits, but he split each of these circuits into 3 stages. So that's like 24 discrete levels of evolution, which, some of Leary's detractors will say that's just making things overly complicated. That's just confusing the matter. But I found that if you actually look at what he's saying and kind of like play around with the concept a little bit, it's very valuable to talk about the 24 stages of evolution. And there are 22 tarot cards. So,
but he has 24. So
yeah, so he added a couple. Good for him. Why not? And the tarot, like, by the time Leary's working on this stuff, the occult revolution or the occult renaissance in Europe is only 100 years old. And he purposefully went back when he started studying psychedelics. He realized that the academic or clinical paperwork on psychedelics was non-existent, or at least insufficient. So he started going back and looking at other people who had experience with psychedelics and altered states of consciousness, and he started talking to and getting inspiration from people like the Beats and from Eastern mystics and yogis and Western ceremonial magic. So, and it's very much a tradition in ceremonial magic and in Western magic to build correspondences between things like tarot and astrology. And Leary was taking part in this tradition when he looked at the trumps and recognized, wow, these trumps are doing, these trumps are describing more or less with a little, with a little adding cards and moving things around and slightly changing the order and the numbering. He saw that there is a lot that tarot had to say, the tarot trumps had to say about his thoughts on consciousness, and he had a lot to say about the tarot. So now, this might be in the weeds a little bit, but now you're talking about tarot cards. You're talking about correspondences. If Leary was really onto something, his levels of evolution would map onto like the Kabbalistic tree of life. And I think that the four worlds of the Kabbalah map beautifully onto the highest world where we are when we talk about Indra's net. That would be circuit 8 and 7. And then as you go down into manifestation, as you become a physical human being, it's like each of the four worlds cleanly maps on the two circuits. So that was kind of mind blowing for me. I feel like occultists or people exploring altered states of consciousness could learn a lot just by taking Leary a little more seriously and a little more at face value. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. About you talked about the importance in ceremonial magic about building correspondences between things, and then in my mind, that's very similar to what we just said about the importance of external influences on consciousness that Leary was always interested in from the beginning, and it's not a matter of just sort of. I mean, you get external correspondences in group therapy more so than you would get individually. Just examine your own consciousness, and you would get in external correspondences more in. You drew the, even at Millbrook, they were talking about Gurdjieff and some of the Gurdjieffian practices that they had there. I mean, it's all about there is a lot of symmetry in what he's saying, and
I will say too, just to keep things grounded in like kind of psychology and not to like wander too far into the temples of the Golden Dawn. A lot of occultists misunderstand correspondences in Western or in any magical practice. A lot of people see correspondences as like revealing some sort of profound truth. This tarot trump maps on to this color, maps on to this Egyptian deity, to this rock, or this magical element. But the way I look at it is through creating a system of correspondences, you creating a mental framework that allows magic or mystical states to happen. So like, it's not like the correspondences are like bedrock truth. It's a tool that is used to help the practitioner. So when Leary, fudges the names of the tarot trumps or flips them around or whatever, it's totally valid. I mean, first of all, anybody who writes about tarot, for instance, tends to like alter it a little bit and as however they like. But also it's like he's not like discussing the world as it is. He's trying to create a system that's internally consistent and that we can, look at and kind of use it as a telescope to look at reality around us. So I've successfly avoided listing the 8 circuits now for a good 10 minutes.
No. Well, we can go on to the new cards that he has in the tarot deck. Maybe would that be interesting? Because I think that kind of goes on with the 8 circle a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah. Let me. You know what? I want to grab my book. I want to get.
I've got it right here. Right? Here, you can have mine.
Let's check. So the 8th circuit, neuroatomic circuit. Leary thought that evolution. See, anything that we experience of like the four circuits, that the four mystical or magical or post-terrestrial circuits, is really just a foretaste of what, like, I'm speaking as Leary. I have my own opinions, but it's really a foretaste of like what we can expect, whatever comes after human beings can expect to experience. So we're not like, so yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. So it's kind of like we're discussing these things in kind of like, it's like a dog discussing algebra or something. So the eighth circuit is the circuit of the post-human spacefaring creature who finally makes it to the black hole at the center of the galaxy, that Leary kind of decided or assumed that it existed there because it was beckoning to us. And then like once us human individuals make it back there and go into the black hole, then we become united with the whole, it's like our intelligence, which seems to be fragmented in, however many billion human beings, is actually one with the universe, higher intelligence, and we'll be back. We'll return to it. Which that doesn't help us much.
Well, it's my analogy would be like David Bohm on DMT.
Yeah. So it's like, if we start at the top, and it's very vague. And actually, I kind of think Leary didn't have to add the extra 2 cards because I see like I see circuit 8 as like a placeholder circuit. It's like go back to, it's like a placeholder. It's for whatever is so far beyond human that we can't really explain it intelligently. And so why not sum it up in 1 card? You didn't need to invent 2 more cards, but I guess he wanted everything to line up mathematically. So he invented 2 cards. He called the Star Maker. And again, so now we're like in post-human consciousness. We're talking about a character that can like that has some sort of vague mastery over nuclear and gravitational forces in the greater universe. So it's like, I don't know how that helps us, but and the other, he called the final card, he referred to as the Velvet Hole, spelled WHOLE, which black hole sounds so scary, but he saw the black hole as being warm and soft and inviting and
Aquarian.
Absolutely. So so that's circuit 8. Like, it's very confusing. It's yeah, I mean, there's a reason that most mystics don't have much to say about that level of consciousness, and I certainly don't have much to say about it.
Yeah, I think the Velvet Hole is I like that description on the ineffable.
I always get kind of weirded out when Timothy Leary starts talking about like sensual pleasure, and
Yeah.
it's like it'd be like your grandfather talking to you about sex or something. It's like, ugh.
Yeah. So the cards that the descriptions that he have that's in your book on the cards, are those coming from something that he published somewhere, or how? Because I know that there was some. I mean, a lot of this you kind of scraped together from some various sources.
That came from my study of the tarot and trying to understand Western occultism and correspondence is about kind of dividing experience up into like building a filing cabinet for experience, like you know, in a very real way, you could consider the 22 tarot trumps as being kind of like the sum total of human experience split into 22 categories. So, which is kind of vague, but so when you read books, some of these like really good books on tarot, like The Way of the Tarot by Alejandro Jodorowsky and his co-author Marianne Costa, I think her name is, or Meditations on the Tarot, which was written by some Catholic mystic, an anonymous Catholic mystic 100 years ago or 75 years ago. They tackle kind of on a philosophical level what each of the tarot trumps means and how, and then it's up to the reader to kind of the tarot reader to figure out how to translate that into more mundane human terms, like, you're going to get fired, your husband's cheating on you, whatever people go to tarot readers for. And so I kind of set out to do that with my book. So I'm reading Leary's ideas about evolution and the cosmos, and trying to like, how do I kind of make these things mundane? How do I make these things helpful to a just like a regular tarot card reader? Because I think it works both ways. I think if you can explain the importance of Leary's ideas more simply, then that gives an entree to an exploration of his ideas that can get more complex as you go deeper into it. So the tarot trumps, the descriptions, and it's like very much the second half of the book is very much tradition, like written like a traditional tarot book. It's like lists the cards, lists what Leary thought of the cards, and then how they relate to human life, how you could use it in a reading, essentially. Which I don't, Leary was he made fun of people who use tarot for divination. He was like, this is this important, profound work that, the tarot is essentially a book that explains the unfolding of evolution from the tiniest cells to, us returning to the black hole, the center of the galaxy. But you're going to use it for something as mundane as like fortune telling. But he also used it for fortune telling. So.
Yeah, he had a spread.
Yeah, exactly. He, which I think that was the kind of thing he was like trying to like not shed light on later as the 60s turned into the 70s, and the fad, the new age fad, of hippies burning incense and reading tarot cards and casting astrological tables kind of became passe. I think he didn't want to like really draw attention to the fact that he wrote occult books for a number of years. But
so what, a thought occurred to me that when you were discussing of what advantage would there be in unpacking sort of Leary's belief if we had all of his ideas like a tarot deck in correspondences, as opposed to, just reading about it in a book. I mean, what sort of, is it a way that we can connect with him more, like, or why wasn't this book just a tarot deck perhaps of Leary? I mean, that might be another way to ask it. What if it was a tarot deck, is there something about Leary that would be sort of a deeper connection because it is a tarot deck?
Leary presented the tarot as symbolizing his ideas. So he wasn't like, so he didn't like really put a ton of thought into like, he didn't design a deck. He didn't put a ton of thought into the actual physical tarot. He was using, tarot trumps really is a metaphor for exploring his ideas. I think that taking it, making a physical, creating an actual tarot deck and doing things that you do with tarot decks, whether it be they can be used in ritual, cards can be used in ritual, they can be used as ways to focus attention or to for like Jungian active imagination practices.
Yeah.
I think having a guide like this of Leary's ideas in a form that actually could be available to practitioners of magic, I think it adds another layer of the already rich tapestry of like Western magic. So it's not going to replace your traditional tarot book, but it will complement it. If you've been like exploring the tarot for a number of years, and then you look up Leary's version of, the strength card or something, there's going to be some things that are the same. There are going to be some things that are different, but I think like the way they communicate with each other, I think will bring people like, like hopefully people will see some wisdom in that.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Maybe one of the other concepts I think was interesting in the book you talked about is re-imprinting. And I'm wondering if that could be at all relevant to this discussion about as a transformational tool.
Yeah. So he had he and Robert Anton Wilson had a very kind of, so imprinting is something that happens in the animal world. It's a form of learning that happens in the animal world. So the famous, the famous example is Konrad Lorenz was present when a bunch of ducklings were hatched. And since their mother wasn't there, they imprinted him as the mother. So they would like follow him around and treat him like he was their mother. And that's a form of learning. They learned that, but it's not like, but it was something that happened instantly, and it happened accidentally because anybody could have been standing there, but it was him. And so I'm not super up on the science of that because I'm not a scientist, but Leary and Wilson saw that as a powerful metaphor. I call it a metaphor. They probably thought it was closer to reality of like how human beings develop their personality in various stages of their life. So Leary would say that, when you're in the area of like circuit 1 imprint and vulnerability, which is a biosurvival, which is where the young human is really only concerned with safety or danger. And if you get a certain imprint just by accident, a heavy negative imprint, then that creates a very fearful human. And it expresses itself, if you're like a fundamentally fearful person trying to get through the world, as you grow up and get older and your ideas and your personality becomes more complex, there'll always be this little fearful guy underneath kind of coloring your perceptions. Or the reverse, if you're like in a loving environment and you think that the world is largely healthy and safe, that will influence how you see the world. So Leary and Wilson, kind of specified that there were four stages of this imprint vulnerability through development. So beyond the first stage, which is like safety and danger, there is the second stage, which is top dog, bottom dog. Either you're an alpha male or you're the runt of the litter, or most of us are somewhere in between that. But So that now that's another lens through which you see the world. And then next is what he called the oral semantic, or maybe just the semantic circuit, which it's language, it's symbols. If you're dexterous with symbolic thinking, if you're a good talker, if you're a good writer, versus people who are clumsy, who are like not great writers, not great thinkers. And then the fourth is the sociosexual circuit. And it's called that because it deals with sex, but it deals more with the ramifications of sexuality, as far as once you start having sex, you're having kids. Once you start having kids, you're having family. You're either taking on a parental role, or you're not taking on a parental role. He saw 4 stages of life and 4 areas where we are accidentally, through whatever reason, and probably a combination of biology and nature and nurture. We pick up these like 4 kind of styles of personality. And that really, I think Leary saw that as the tragedy of being human, is that we're trapped in these roles. And he saw his work as creating, using psychedelic assisted therapy or various mystical or magical practices as ways to loosen up the imprint and allow you to self-direct. Like the ultimate, like, if he's right, and if if these techniques are perfected and created, we would have a situation where this is like a very like simplistic example, but it's like, I'm paranoid. I'm afraid all the time. I'm scared. It's ruining my life. Go to a clinic somewhere. They give you LSD. They reprogram you, and now you're fearless. So you've suspended your circuit 1 imprint and redefined who you are in that domain. Obviously, the world isn't that easy. Nothing's that easy. I personally have some kind of like, I don't necessarily think that imprints or even circuits are strictly true. Like, they're not, they're, I see them more as a metaphor to explain the complexity of psychology, as opposed to saying like, we literally have a circuit in our brain. We literally can re-imprint. I think that these are useful metaphors for describing what goes on in here. But I don't even necessarily think that like imprints are something that can be changed radically. Like, maybe soften, maybe you can, I think humans really are who they are. And, the idea of just like finding a switch, a chemical key, and changing that is probably a little naive and simplistic, but you can appreciate Leary's perspective on what it is, what these levels of consciousness are and how we use them as a tool in your practice, beyond, I think the truth is more subtle and more interesting and less naive than maybe what Leary and his guys were getting at in the 1970s.
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting take on, and this isn't probably the right word to describe it, but like, scientific reductionist, materialist, but what it's being reduced to is something that is, and I keep using the word cosmic, but it's, it's just reducing it and reducing it to something that is sort of more sort of trippy, less sort of material in the way. And, like it's a quantum entanglement, you're connecting with the idea of quantum entanglement, that everything's all interconnected, but it's still, you're still reducing it to that and explaining it to that. But like you said perfectly, it's, these are all just great metaphors.
Absolutely. I try to walk a line because I find this stuff fascinating, but I am very much. It is possible to explore these things, these fields, these realms without like resorting to pseudoscience or like like the amount of friends I have who think they're quantum physicists because they read some book that relates quarks to their supposed magical powers. It's just really ridiculous. But like I refer to in these interviews, I often refer to Timothy Leary as a pseudoscientist or his work as pseudoscience. And I don't mean that to cast aspersions or to say it's not valuable, but it's not the scientific method. It's him. He came, he was always very aware of the science around him, the science of the day, and he was very interested in it. And he came from, his background was in experimental psychology. So he had that language and he had that way of looking at the world, which I think was very valuable in helping him come up with his ideas. But that's not what, his, that's not what his work was. His work was, it was like his work was mysticism, but kind of using the language of then contemporary science to, put a different spin on it and try to, put a different, view it from a different perspective, which I find valuable as long as you don't confuse the two things. Like, as long as you don't confuse eight circuit theory with nuclear physics, we'll probably be fine.
Yeah. And you had mentioned in the book, back to his Leary's prowess as a scientist, that the re-examination of like the Harvard prison experiment by somebody who was much more methodical, like Richard Doblin, about going through maybe they didn't get the results they were talking about. When you actually follow through with the study, which was probably not Leary's strength, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, they were, Leary really lived the lives of 10 men, like he, like some people are just like that. Like I hope to live the life of one man at some point in my life, but
who is this man?
But he was like doing all over the place. So he wasn't the guy that was going to create the study and then follow through with it, even though he had an organization. He had they started, they had an organization. They were working under the auspices of Harvard, Harvard psilocybin project. But I mean, you need people like that. And then, but if we lived in a world that was a little less fearful or a lot less fearful, the value that was in those early studies would have been understood and expanded upon. And I mean, that's how you get progress. One wild man has an idea, they try it out, somebody looks at it and goes, oh, there might be something here. And then they keep working at it. Like the tragedy of...
Yeah. Then the administrators come in and
or just people who like, like the scientists, but no, like Leary and his people started getting interesting results and everybody freaked out and then they threw him in jail.
So. Yeah, several times.
Yeah. Then he escaped and they threw him back in. So
yeah. Well, you wanted the one other thing that I thought was interesting. You talked about Leary on Darwin. Back to the sort of the scientific examination about its natural election, not survival of the fittest, which I thought kind of is typical. I mean, now that you kind of get a sense of Leary, that of course he would say that,
Yeah, and I love that. Like, I mean, it's wonderful. Like, do I want to live in a world of, survival of the fittest? Do I want to live in a world where like the sperm like battle each other over the egg, or do I want to live in a world where the sperm kind of dance and then one gets invited in? It's like it's. I mean, the real pleasure in writing this book was I got to spend a year and a half and now another, however long we're going to be promoting the book, inside the head of somebody who had a vision that was optimistic and was expansive and began at the dawn of time and ends at, and will end at cosmic consciousness, however many hundreds of thousands of years in the future. And it really just puts things in a perspective that you don't get when you're just glued to your phone being told how terrible the world is over and over and over. So it was a real delight being in that. And I think I hope people get that out of it if they, pick up the book that they.
It's the velvet hole.
It's the velvet hole. Return to the velvet hole.
Well, what now that you've got this, so what's your next adventure going to be on? Your next mischief? Or I'm still, maybe you should do a Leary tarot deck. That would be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I made one. Like I have my own homemade one, and I've been practicing with it. I think, my next big project is a book on the nature of belief, why we understand belief, and how belief can be used the same way as, the correspondences are used to create a situation where magic or evolution or consciousness expansion can occur. And that's actually based on the work of this crotchety, very little known sorcerer that lived in like rural Pennsylvania, who passed away maybe 10 years ago. He had a concept he called subjective synthesis. And it was basically, he talked about how subjective synthesis is this condition where you create, I basically explained it earlier, you create the conditions for change before you actually are able to change. And I see so many parallels with that and like the social media and how we interact with the media now. I feel like they've kind of hijacked this process and made it industrial. So it's kind of like so that book is going to be, it's about the nature of belief and how it is used and abused. But aside from that, I'd like to continue working with Leary's ideas. And, like I said, I made a tarot deck. I'm kind of like working with traditional tarot practices using Leary's deck as opposed to others and kind of stress testing it. And I'll just keep exploring these strange new worlds.
Yeah. And there is something about sort of the open-endedness of Leary that kind of fits into sort of tarot, where it's sort of, you have things morphing into other things, and it's not like there's a rigid structure of beginning or end, or I don't know. It's just, it just seems that idea about his ideas being like a tarot deck and just seemed to be,
the Fool card and the tarot deck is often placed at the beginning or at the end. And I think it really, in fact, if I were to, in my tarot deck that I influenced by Leary, I renamed the Velvet Hole as the Fool. Like I see it as getting to the end of that as like looping back to the beginning. Leary, Leary never made the argument like that this is the end point of humanity. Like he never made, like if you take Leary seriously, you don't see a beginning, a middle, and an end. You see a beginning, a middle, and an end, which takes you back to the beginning.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. He wisely just punted the question of why are we here? Moved the goalpost because who knows?
Yeah, I'm reading your book about the Fool, and Leary linked the Fool to the floating, sucking amoeba, emphasizing the two functions it shares with the newborn. So that is the beginning, like you said, the circling all the way back, from the velvet hole to the Fool, and maybe at the end the velvet hole is the sucking amoeba,
Yeah.
the newborn. That's what the universe is. That's what we are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Lenny, it's been a delight talking to you. I think this has kind of been a very interesting discussion. Is if people are interested in connecting more with your other works and movies and all kinds of stuff, you've got all kinds of stuff in your CV, so to speak.
Yeah, I do too much. My website is lennyflatley.net, or if you go to my Substack, actually, my Substack newsletter is where you get all the updates and all the good stuff, and that's lennyflatley.substack.com. And I would tell people to check that out.
Yeah, so the Substack would probably be a good place.
Yeah. If you can include a link to that would be great.
I'll do that. I'll definitely do that.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
I need to write no, that's a good. We'll make sure we get a thing, and we'll figure out what sort of image we want to portray of Mr. Leary, since he was the reincarnation of Aleister Crowley.
Apparently, I still don't understand that. I've reread because, he told that to Robert Anton Wilson, and then he explained how that would work, and it makes no sense to me. And I know Douglas Rushkoff asked Leary about it, and Leary was like, he's like, yeah, but you were born while Leary was still alive. And Leary was just like, yelled at him. He's like, what's that matter? We're just trying to figure out what the hell you're talking about.
Well, maybe in some ways we're the reincarnation of Timothy Leary.
Maybe. I'll take it,
There you go. You'd be closer to the timeline.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Lenny. I appreciate your time, and have a wonderful weekend.
Oh, I appreciate your time, and this has been fun. I hadn't heard of your podcast before this, but I've checked it out since then, and really into it. So it's interesting. How long have you been doing it?
Since 1846.
1846. You were the first Telegraph podcast.
That's right. No, it's probably been 8 years or so. I lost track.
Yeah, well, God bless you. I couldn't. Well, I can't do anything for 8 years. But
you've had podcasts though, and yours are more interesting than mine. I mean,
I get on them, and it's like I had my COVID era podcast because everybody had one of those. And then that kind of lost interest. And then, or just never had it's not really what I want to do. Like, the last thing I want to do is have a podcast. But sometimes I have opportunities to, like for a while, this company was paying me to do a podcast. So, I did it. Or for a while, it was like I needed to monetize my work because it was the pandemic and nobody could leave the house. So I did one then. But, I just don't really have the interest. I'd rather appear on other podcasts. That to me is the
well. You're welcome here anytime. So
great.
Whenever that obscure, esoteric, rural Pennsylvania dude book is done, let me know.
I'll add you to my mailing list.
Okay,
and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Lenny.
Thank you.